coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
The fact that this guy is being celebrated is sick. But I mean, you almost expect it from sort of the X handles that people can hide behind that don't have their actual name on them in the dark alley, back room, chat room type places. But college professors, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised, but I still am surprised. I mean, Julia Alexeyeva, maybe a professor at Penn, where that guy went to school, says she's never been prouder to be a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I mean, she should be fired on the spot and banned from ever educating anyone ever again. Former Washington Post columnist, you just mentioned her, Taylor Lorenz, wrote, and people wonder why we want these executives dead. Wanted posters, as you said, they're being put up all over New York City with all of the CEOs of healthcare companies, and it's their face, and it says wanted dead or alive, and alive is crossed out. And then there's one of the United Healthcare CEO, and his face is crossed out, meaning they already got him. There's been this outpouring of sympathy for the killer, a Central Park lookalike contest. Stephen Colbert praised his shirtless abs on his program. That's sick. But the media is obsessed with covering this. How about covering the sadness of a father and a husband and a family that's going through a tragedy because this man was murdered in cold blood?
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host for the day, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined by Spencer Clavin, the poetry editor for the American Mind. It's a running gag that we
Please, no, Ryan. Please don't send us any poetry submissions.
Yeah, disregard.
Yeah, there's no such thing. There is
Denounce. Yeah. Mike Sabo, managing editor of the American Mind, and a guest, which we hope to have on somewhat regularly if he's not too busy, Gates Garcia, Lincoln Fellow of the Claremont Institute this past summer, and a man about town in the greater Northwest Florida region, doing lots of good foundation work and working on many projects. So we're happy to have you, Gates.
I don't read poetry, but I do let Spencer rehearse it to me quite a bit, and that's filling enough.
Yeah. It's a routine. You call me up on like a Sunday night.
We'll start off with a very unpoetic topic in a way, although it may be poetic justice when it's all said and done, and that is the recent oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court for this case about the prohibition in Tennessee of transgender care. I want to uneuphemize this whole thing. The left wants to say gender affirming care. We'll just say it's Tennessee having due regard for the health, safety, and morals of its citizens in good state police power fashion by prohibiting gender reassignment procedures, drugs, etc. for minors in the state of Tennessee. And that's United States versus Skrmetti. I think I'm pronouncing that right. The oral argument was revealing. I mean, you had the usual divides of right and left. You had the sensational and kind of hysterical analogy drawn by Ketanji Brown Jackson that the thing that really came to her mind when she thinks of Tennessee prohibiting gender reassignment care, drugs, etc., was Loving v. Virginia, or the state of local law in Virginia before Loving v. Virginia. This, of course, is the famous case that struck down Virginia's laws against miscegenation, that is, the races marrying each other, especially black and white. I think leaving most of the country that was paying attention to that oral argument somewhat puzzled by the analogy, but it's predictable on today's modern left. Sotomayor looked to be aligned with Justice Jackson, maybe for slightly different reasons, but that's about it. I mean, Elena Kagan, the other liberal on the court, seemed pretty skeptical about the Solicitor General of the United States, or I forget if she's deputy, claims, and also the lawyer for the ACLU. This is not a joke. Chase Strangio, himself a female to male trans person. They didn't seem to find a welcome audience in the court. Thomas, Alito, the chief, and Kavanaugh all pretty skeptical for slightly different reasons. of the claim that the court ought to strike down laws in basically 26 states now against this sort of procedure for minors, citing the sort of thin expert testimony and or evidence that this is an essential healthcare thing for minors. We should note that the UK, I think, announced today, has now banned this sort of care for minors in the entire United Kingdom. So the tea leave readers of the court would be very, very surprised if this law gets struck down. And I think the question will just be what kind of ruling Roberts writes. Last note, and then I'll turn it over to all you guys for comment. The last note, interestingly, the silent justice for the day was Justice Gorsuch. And this was revealing. I'm not the first one to bring it up, but in many ways, he may have been contemplating some unintended consequences, at least to him, although they were not unintended to us, from his ruling in Bostock a few years back, where he imported into Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, in some twisted and sophistic originalism, in my opinion, the notion that it protected gender identity as well as sex. So there we are. You're in Tennessee, Spencer. What do you make of all this?
I sure am. I mean, I'm proud of my state, at least moderately, if in fact we managed to carry this through. Here's what I think. I think that Chase Strangio and her consequences have been a disaster for the human race. This person is utterly deranged. We have, I should note, not one, but two Dickensian names on this podcast this week. There's Chase Strangio, and then there's the guy who we'll talk about in a bit, who seems to have murdered the CEO of a health insurance company. But no, I mean, Gorsuch is sitting there, I'm sure, thinking, well, if it isn't the entirely foreseeable consequences of my philosophical position in Bostock, which was slightly different from this case. It was a statute, I believe, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, one of the titles of the Civil Rights Act, according to which, according to Bostock, you can't discriminate against a man who wants to wear a dress if you would be accepting of a woman who wants to wear a dress. And this is an even more tendentious argument. This is based on the 14th Amendment, that you're somehow not affording equal protection to boys and girls if, for instance, you had a boy that was experiencing delayed puberty or any number of other health complications and therefore needed testosterone. You would allow a doctor to prescribe that. And therefore, of course, you should also allow a girl to be prescribed testosterone for the equally serious and totally real problem of being born in the wrong body. And you're right, Ryan, it doesn't look like this is going to fly. But I think you also alluded to an underlying problem when you were attempting, quite rightly, to pick apart the thick web of euphemism that has now been slathered over this whole subject. And of course, the left is very good at this, we know, but it's not just gender affirming care, it's affirming, it's gender. I mean, every word in that phrase stands atop this enormous edifice of completely psychotic assumptions. And even in this case where it seemed like the judges were very skeptical, there wasn't really, to my mind, enough challenge to the whole set of premises of this ideology. I mean, what I would like to see is for a Trump administration and the Supreme Court to repudiate utterly the whole notion that there exists, detached and free-floating from the human body, a spectral emanation called gender. I mean, this is like the emanations of the penumbra of the body, like makes you feel like you're somehow wrong at some deep physical level. And there's no difference between cutting off your genitalia and getting a prescription for cough medicine. That's kind of the presumption here. Strangio was called out on it a couple times on some of the internal contradictions of these ideas. But as long as these are admissible notions, I think you're going to have the door opened to these extraordinarily absurd, facially absurd arguments, like that the law can't possibly tell the difference in a beneficial way between a guy that needs help through puberty and a girl that wants to become a guy. I mean, these are like just extremely elaborate word games. I hope that we'll take a step in the right direction here. But the Bostock case is a good example of how that language, if you don't pay real close attention to it, ensnares even notionally conservative justices like Gorsuch.
Yeah, let me just clarify my mangling of the Bostock holding, as you politely did, Spencer, just so everyone's straight on this. So the real question was, you're right, Spencer, Title VII. Does Title VII of the 64 Act, which prohibits against employment discrimination because of sex, encompass discrimination based on an individual's sexual orientation? But the language in it and the reasoning in it by Gorsuch left it to be a pretty easy, not even a leap, I would say a step towards the implicit argument of the parties in favor of striking down this Tennessee law in Skrmetti. That is to say, look, if it covers sexual orientation, if sex in the 64 Act covers sexual orientation, it's not that hard to extend that reasoning on grounds of equal protection to sexual identification, regardless of whatever one's natural sex is.
What stood out to me was how little the conservative justices pressed the Solicitor General and the ACLU on whether the classification is even sex-based. I mean, we could talk about Gorsuch kind of sitting out, but the ones that did participate were a little disappointing. I mean, if you're going to draw a line about what is permissible and it's sex, then the government has to be, they have to have a role, and that role needs to be reasonable. The government and the ACLU say it is sex-based because the whole thing is based on sex. Well, a boy can get testosterone, but a girl can't. But then, Tennessee says, no, this is a statute that draws a line on purpose. What is the purpose of the surgery? The government and the ACLU, they're kind of playing games with language. You all already alluded to this, which is how we got into this whole sort of trans movement mess that we're in. And as far as the leftists, judges go, they were bad as expected. Sotomayor wasn't asking questions to seek information that she didn't already know. She was grandstanding on the value of the treatments. And then we've already talked about Ketanji Brown Jackson. I mean, when you compare this to interracial marriage, which has nothing to do with health, I think your credibility goes out the window. So I think the judges on the right were disappointing. They weren't as good as they could have been, and the left was bad as expected.
And I think there's a case in Texas, actually in 2024, Justice Blacklock of the Supreme Court of Texas. I actually found this. The Ethics and Public Policy Center did a amicus brief in Skrmetti. And these two paragraphs from this Texas justice were kind of the main feature of this. And I think this gets to what is actually going on here at bottom. It really is, do we fundamentally deny reality, or do we say, yes, there are givens? Sex, that is a given. I think if I remember correctly, I think even Harry Jaffa said in one of his essays, if you don't understand that, you basically deny reality. You can't even do philosophy if you don't understand these basic building blocks. And so getting back to this Supreme Court of Texas, Justice Blacklock, he said, look, on one side, the first vision, called the traditional vision, holds that a boy is a boy, a girl is a girl. Neither feelings and desires nor drugs and surgery can change this immutable genetic truth, which binds us all. Within the traditional vision, human males and females do not identify as men and women. We are men and women, irreducibly and inescapably, no matter how we feel. The second vision, we call it the transgender vision, holds that we all have a sex assigned at birth, which usually corresponds to our physical traits, but which may or may not correspond to our inwardly felt or outwardly expressed gender identity. It holds that a person's gender identity is a constitutive part of his or her humanity, and that when a person's biological sex and gender identity diverge, often gender identity should be given top priority. So I think that fundamental problem is really at base here. And then even just going to the Gorsuch thing, I was reading Ed Whelan, his kind of accounts and bench memos in National Review. And I hope he's right about this, he says that the language in Title VII, that because of sex, that's not there in the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, that hopefully that means that Gorsuch should come out with a different view on this case. Again, I hope he's right. But, as we all saw in Bostock, I think Gorsuch twisted the language that was there. I don't know what he could possibly twist in this case, but it's not, unfortunately, beyond the shadow of a doubt. I mean, just because you're a conservative or originalist, unfortunately, that does not mean you're going to reach the right decision, unfortunately.
Yeah, I had hoped that Blacklock, I mean, the opinion's good and his clarity in that case is worth everyone reading. But the traditionalist vision, maybe it does more work and is more appealing to a wider audience, but I suspect we will see a dilation on the nature of human beings and the natural law, at least in dicta, especially from Clarence Thomas. And that's the inescapable root of all of this confusion. I mean, the traditionalist view in America is not merely traditional, but also reasonable, as the founders would have understood it.
Right.
In other words, it's rooted in what people are by their nature. And look, it doesn't mean you don't have room for weird anomalies. That's, in fact, you understand the rule by exceptions to it, as we do in many things. And so, of course, there's this tiny, narrow part of the population that has a hormone imbalance, and they may be girls with too much testosterone, like that boxer in the Olympics, or men with too much estrogen. But really, the rule is the norm. And the norm of human nature is, of course, biological sex. It's, don't quote me, I'm not an expert on the statistics, but I suspect it's about 99% of the population that conforms to what we would traditionally understand and reasonably understand to be how human nature works, and thus how we ought to structure our laws, many layers down from that original fundamental truth.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, because I think that's actually exactly where a lot of conservative, quote, originalist jurisprudence can go wrong, is basically saying, oh, we can't do natural law, we can't do this, we just rely on tradition. Well, but how do you distinguish between good and bad tradition? So I think that's exactly right. That's where you have to bring the things that are, the Constitution presupposes, and that's so important. These natural law realities that we're all in.
This was, if you'll recall, the subject of a now somewhat forgotten exchange between Clarence Thomas and none other than Senator Joe Biden at his confirmation hearing, in which Thomas was held to account for his bizarre, extreme, marginal, and obscure views on this thing called natural law. What could he possibly mean by this? I mean, the current still president of the United States treats the whole idea as if it were like a tribal belief in darkest Africa, rather than the framework within which the West has basically always operated. The only point I was going to make is it seems significant to me that this is also ultimately the backdrop of the abortion debate as well. I mean, Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson in neck and neck in stiff competition for the stupidest Supreme Court justice in history. But Sotomayor in the abortion cases has basically been arguing about human beings on the analogy of toasters. Like, this is and this is something that we have to face up to, not just because the question of whether an infant in the womb is at stake is a person, not just because of this gender stuff, but because, of course, all of this is also going to come up in the future with technology. That as technology makes it more and more possible to alter some of our previously immutable characteristics, we're going to have to ask ourselves how, when, and why. And the answers either come from some kind of idea, however vague, about human nature, or they're nowhere to be found.
What strikes me with all this is consistent with a lot of issues going on in the DEI movement. We've been at this long enough to where we're now finally seeing the results materialize in the real world. When all these sort of ideas came about, they were just ideas and let's try them out and see what happens. But now we have real data. And Ryan, you mentioned the studies in Europe where, this was going on in Europe, and they actually said, no more of this. It's no good. We have the data. And if you look at the US, we've now entered the period of detransitioning, where we have enough people that have lived in a transitioned body for long enough that they're deciding that no, this was a major mistake. I made this mistake when I was too young to be rational enough to think about these things clearly and mature enough, and I want to detransition. So we're seeing that movement. We're also seeing that transitions are a major cause for suicides and a major cause for depression that maybe didn't exist before the transition. So I would love to see gender dysphoria talked about more as a mental health issue, just like a lot of other things in life that have unintended consequences. And maybe we can sort of address these issues before they even become issues by focusing on the real health issues.
Yeah, and Ryan, I think you sort of mentioned this, and Mike too, that it's only from within some kind of framework of normalcy that you can compassionately and sensibly talk about edge cases, of which I personally believe there are many. Like, I'm probably a squish relative to, say, a Clarence Thomas, in that I think, like, human nature is full of variety. A lot of it is actually good variety, and that sensible, compassionate societies can make room in their framework for exceptions to the rule. But you can only do that if you can understand them as exceptions, because otherwise you end up destroying life for the 99% of people who get by just fine on the norm. I mean, this is sort of, I think, similar to some of the conversations we have about just social norms, right? Like most people in life get by well with a really strong script, like get married before you have kids, get a job, like do all of these things that kind of follow a particular pattern. And yes, there are people who are not fit to that pattern and for whom the imposition of that pattern can be very painful, which means it's kind of a worthwhile discussion how to alleviate those problems and how to get along well. But you can't just destroy life for everybody else by totally reworking everything according to every tick and eccentricity.
Yeah, Gates brought up the detransitioners, and there's a prominent case now, pretty new, I think just a week old or so. But this Dr. Olson Kennedy who's built a thriving, big, and his transgender treatment center. I think it might be at UCLA, but don't quote me. But it's in Los Angeles, and she's one of the leading practitioners of this sort of quote unquote medicine. And she's being sued by Kaya Clementine Breen, who thinks she was rushed through the process, even contravening sort of normal medical ethical rules that have been laid out, which is to take at least 6 months to make the sort of decision. It was recommended to her earlier than that. And so I hope this is one of many lawsuits, and that a big component of taking down this medical infrastructure, which has made, it's a whole industry. It has made a lot of people and a lot of people in the pharmaceutical industry quite wealthy performing this sort of thing, psychiatrists, psychologists, and surgeons. And I think let 1,000 lawsuits bloom will be one way, sick the trial attorneys on them will be one way to reintroduce some sanity to this, to the benefit, I think, of a lot of confused kids and a lot of parents who've been browbeaten into this process, citing pretty much bunk social science. The line that they always use is, well, do you want a live trans kid or a dead non-trans kid? And there's this sort of moral blackmail and pressure at the heart of this, and it's linked to a lot of the practitioners to their own financial well-being and continued success. So it's a mess on many levels.
That's an example of the kind of rhetoric we're talking about, where that's like suicide bomber levels of evil. That's incredibly corrupt and disgusting to threaten a parent with their child's own death if they don't go along with this thing that somebody just thought up 5 minutes ago. And we have, I think, reached a point at which, on the one hand, this stuff is so ingrained that we don't even, like, even us on this podcast don't even feel it perhaps as deeply as we should, that this is like really psychotic and wrong. On the other hand, psychotic and wrong ideas produce disastrous results, which, as Gates was saying, are making themselves felt so intensely in the part of these poor children whose lives are ruined by this stuff, that we may be kind of at a turning point. It's felt for a while as if we had passed peak trans, and it can't come soon enough.
And Ryan, you bring up the point about money. I mean, we could have a whole podcast alone on the amount of money that is in this space and how we got here, because a lot of it, like most things or a lot of things in life, are driven by money, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes. I want to get in one more point that was just struck me about this whole thing, and it's the left and discrimination. The left is calling this discrimination. It's not discrimination, it's protection. These are procedures that cause irreversible damage to minors. We don't let 10-year-olds drive cars. We don't let minors buy cigarettes, drink, or get tattoos, but they can surgically or medically change their gender. I mean, it just seems ludicrous to me. This is a common sense issue. These surgeries on girls prevent them from being able to have babies. So it's appropriate for a 12-year-old to go through this procedure, but then she may want to determine at 30 that she wants to start a family then, but she doesn't have that issue. That's sad. So, and whatever happened to tomboys? I mean, I knew a ton of tomboys growing up, and most of them grew up, it was funny, it was cute, and most of them grew up to be beautiful, thriving, successful women. Give me a break about the whole discrimination thing. That's the left's favorite word to use, and it's getting tired.
Yeah, and you drew the connection to DEI, Gates, and it's apt as well on the financial side, although it's much more pernicious. I mean, DEI is a thriving industry. You have all these consultants charging, $1,600 an hour or $10,000 a day or whatever, basically selling snake oil, racialized identity snake oil to companies and working groups and schools of higher education. And at least they are just grifters, and they're doing some damage, to be sure. They're warping Americans' understanding of rights and the history of discrimination and racism in the country. But it pales in comparison to the people financially benefiting from permanently sterilizing young people. So there's that one other. Yeah.
It's so darkly funny to me that, like, I can't even come up with a reasonable, difficult case that this decision might produce. At least when you talk about abortion, they trot out some tragic, awful scenario in which basically no law creates a positive outcome, because there simply are no positive outcomes. You can be like, yeah, I can see how you have to be really delicate kind of drawing these lines and have to be really careful about your language. It's like, what problem is going to emerge by just saying flatly you cannot sterilize children? Like, I profoundly fail to see what the negative externalities of that is.
The similarity with the abortion thing too is that it's a federalism issue. Some would like to nationalize both issues, and I think we'd all agree here that the eventual goal should be all 50 states banning this sort of care. But it still remains the case that if you as parents determine that you're going to have a dead child if you don't do this for them, you can always just drive to New York from Tennessee. So it's the remedy is extreme in that sense too, at least given the current state of law and sort of mixed public opinion on the issue. Although a public opinion on the issue is unlike the abortion case in the 70s.
Yeah, this is different.
And since it's like an 80-20 issue, it's probably like a 90-10 issue in favor of laws like this. So it seems
because it's such an insane position. Like, again, I hate to be banging this drum. I know I sound like a broken record, but it's like, if you walk out onto the street at random and just grab somebody by the lapels and say, what would you think about pumping a child full of drugs because she's a tomboy? They would be like, do I need to call the authorities? Like, this is the sort of thing that should be relegated to a mental institution. It kind of reminds me of the way that the Democrats treat the pro-Hamas wing of their coalition. I know that there's actually much more, unfortunately, anti-Semitism on the left than there is hardline trans maximalism, sincerely held, like in the heart. But there is a similar thing with Kamala Harris and Biden, where they've got like 100,000 people in Dearborn or something who feel like it would be a problem for Biden to take a strong stance on Israel. And everybody suddenly says, like, oh my goodness, we must defer to these people. It's like, no, you don't. Like, this is not a meaningful caucus that you need to play to. It literally vanishes as an issue if you just say that it's not going to happen.
Well, it is a coalitional problem for them. One that so far they've been bad at navigating. We'll see how they evolve in the coming years.
And never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake.
That's true. It was, we'll get to Syria at the end, but it's another example of, my wife Amelia reminded me of this, but at some point in the first administration, I think Trump was like, well, let me understand in Syria. So one part of our enemies are killing the other part of our enemies, and the generals want me to intervene. I say just let them kill each other. The complication, of course, was like, I forget, some wag, pointed out that it's another example of the missiles and the missile defense in Israel. It's like my tax dollars and a bunch of missile interceptors, and then somehow also my tax dollars and all the missiles coming in. It was like the CIA's terrorists fighting the Defense Department's terrorists. So each faction wanted us to intervene. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about this extraordinary thing that just happened. I'm sure our listeners, unless they're living under a rock, have seen it all over their social media and just normal media. And that is the recent assassination of the United Healthcare CEO at 6 a.m. outside a hotel by Luigi Mangione, at least for now, what appears to be a somewhat disturbed and in recent year or so increasingly withdrawn 26-year-old who had problems with back pain and watched his mother really struggle with back pain, and both of them kind of churned through the healthcare system and through their insurance provider, United Healthcare, and came to the judgment that his mother had gotten a raw deal and he had as well, and his only solution was to commit this kind of revolutionary act, revolutionary act and horrible act of coldly and calmly pumping 3 bullets into this healthcare CEO, first in his back and then I think in his head, and then walking off. The manhunt took maybe 4 days. They've scooped him up. It's dominating the news, but like all things these days, it may have reached the end of its current life cycle and will be overawed by Syria or the next thing, but we'll continue to roll through our media environment as the case goes to trial. And I suspect what the young man his motive seems to be, at least from how he did it all, really to have gotten himself caught and then used this as a platform to raise this issue and put the spotlight on himself. I think I saw today reporting that there are wanted posters being set up across New York for other healthcare CEOs, not official ones, of course, but ones created by, who knows, Antifa or the left or the anti-healthcare crowd. It's a pretty arresting thing to watch in the United States, and I hope that it doesn't portend a new trend. And I should add finally that Mike Cernovich pointed this out on Twitter a couple days ago, and I thought it was insightful. He said the left's response to this was to say, yes, this is awesome. Healthcare CEOs are bad people and should die. Let's have more of this private justice. And the right's response, especially on the Christian right, was, oh my gosh, this kid struggled with back pain. Let us find other folks in our lives who struggle with back pain and try to help them spiritually and mentally. So that's perhaps most prominently with Taylor Lorenz, of all people. I think she's been now removed from X, but she was sort of celebrating and retweeting along the lines of basically implying at the very least that, yes, this was a good thing. And more healthcare CEOs should fear for their lives.
The guy is a coward, okay? If he wants to be that famous and that celebrated, stay on the scene and let them catch you there. But he runs and gets caught eating his hash brown in the corner of a McDonald's. But Ryan, the fact, picking up right where you just left off, the fact that this guy is being celebrated is sick. But I mean, you almost expect it from sort of the X handles that people can hide behind that don't have their actual name on them in the dark alley, back room, chat room type places. But college professors, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised, but I still am surprised. I mean, Julia Alexeyeva, maybe a professor at Penn, where that guy went to school, says she's never been prouder to be a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I mean, she should be fired on the spot and banned from ever educating anyone ever again. Former Washington Post columnist, you just mentioned her, Taylor Lorenz, wrote, and people wonder why we want these executives dead. Wanted posters, as you said, they're being put up all over New York City with all of the CEOs of healthcare companies, and it's their face, and it says wanted dead or alive, and alive is crossed out. And then there's one of the United Healthcare CEO, and his face is crossed out, meaning they already got him. There's been this outpouring of sympathy for the killer. A Central Park lookalike contest. Stephen Colbert praised his shirtless abs on his program. That's sick. But the media is obsessed with covering this. How about covering the sadness of a father and a husband and a family that's going through a tragedy because this man was murdered in cold blood, regardless of what you think his sort of business affiliation was? But like most things, the media amplifies the wrong message, which promotes nothing but evil. But just look at the two biggest stories in the news right now. You've got this villain being veiled as a hero, and you've got Daniel Penny being portrayed as a villain. What type of man are we trying to celebrate in society? This is having ramifications far down the line. One is a killer, one is a hero, yet the media is reversing the narrative. It is so frustrating and so sad.
Yeah, I just think of Isaiah 5 comes to mind, calling good evil and evil good. So it's just a total mixing between the two. It's just a total reversal. Like you said, Penny should be celebrated. Thank God that the jury did what they did. And that was a very tough case under very difficult circumstances. Alvin Bragg, obviously pushing every button he could, racial and otherwise, doing what O.J. Simpson's attorneys tried to do even all the way back then, trying to racialize it and make it black versus white and all that. And then, like you said, this guy, it looks like his politics could be kind of all over the place. He kind of read Ted Kaczynski a little bit. So that's a little bit harder to discern kind of left versus right. But like you, Ryan, pointed out, I mean, I've seen, every leftist who I've seen kind of talk about this or that's been pointed out, hear people praising. It's been pretty much everybody on the left. Taylor Lorenz was on Piers Morgan. And I think he asked her, what do you make of this? What's the word that comes to mind? I mean, she used Kamala's line, joy. So, and he was kind of stunned, like, joy? What do you mean? And then he started replaying the image, the video of what happened at 6 a.m. right outside of that hotel. So you just have, it's just a picture of something clearly is wrong with the soul of the left. You compare that to Peachy Keenan. She had a great Substack post where she talked about, I think it was her brother-in-law who had, major back issues. She goes through all of that. And then at the end, she says, look, maybe Elon can really help with that. If he helps fix, some of these severe back problems that many more people, I think, are having now, I mean, that could be huge. And then also, I think another good point, too, is, looking at what Luigi was taking. You look at like OxyContin and all of those subjects, and maybe looking at that and saying, maybe some of these should be a little bit more widely available, especially for people with back problems. Maybe because of the blowback to people getting addicted, we've gone kind of too far in the other direction. So I think that's another thing to think about too, just in terms of healthcare policy.
I don't feel we've yet discussed the real victim in this situation, namely me, because my Twitter feed is currently doused, slathered in thirst posts from men and women about this man. And I mean, we should remember that this is kind of from of old. Like, the left loves a tragic hero that's actually an evil terrorist. This is like the Weather Underground. This is any number of civil rights extremists during the civil rights era, I should say, not civil rights extremists, but people that think that they are so morally superior and so underwritten, undersigned, endorsed by the sweep of history that they are above the law. I mean, of course, the guy to get this early on was Dostoevsky. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov embodies exactly the type that we're dealing with here, namely cowardly, slimy little Nietzschean who's sitting around reasoning his grand theories of history. They're always exceptionally overwrought and verbose. And it always cashes out in terms of, as a great man who has world historical significance, or in the case of this guy, Luigi Mangione, it was I guess nobody has really faced up to the problems of American healthcare before me. People know about them, but they haven't taken them to their logical conclusion, which of course is cold-blooded murder in the streets. I mean, this is a type of person. The left has always been a little bit sweet on him. I don't think that, as Gates is saying, this is the last we've seen of this kind of spirit. It's one of many poisonous fruits of the twisted post-Marxist progressive ideology about how history is just kind of carrying forth the righteous on a great wave of progress while all others must be trampled under. It's extraordinarily distasteful and unpleasant. And I don't know how to mass block all of these people at once, or I would. But as Mike Solana pointed out, like, why are we still using the shining ab riddled shirtless photo when we have a mugshot of this guy? Like, surely we should be condemning this not only in verbal but in visual terms. And instead we're hemming and hawing about, oh, well, in fact, like, the healthcare system really does cause all sorts of problems for all sorts of people. I mean, there are problems with healthcare. They can be addressed in political deliberation and debate. Many of them are actually not the ones that people are talking about. I mean, this whole thing about, like, we spend more money and we have lower life expectancy. Like, all of this is actually just kind of par for the course for a very, very rich country like ours. But there's problems with it. All the same, those problems and those issues are really not what you bring up in the wake of a cold-blooded murder. Like, you don't do that. You say that's outside the realm of reasonable discussion. Now we're all moving on as a society to have mature adult conversations about this stuff. But I think there are some, like, real philosophical reasons why this stuff keeps coming up on the left, why people tend to lionize these psychos. And all I can add about this is that I think Mangione means glutton in Italian. So this is a guy who, if the rules of Dickensian literature were real, and if we were following them in real life, this would be a guy who sold like cannoli out of the back of a truck somewhere, which would have been a much more useful occupation for him. Like, come buy, I'm a Luigi Mangione, come buy my cannoli. Instead, unfortunately, he needs to go to jail for forever and ever.
Let me ask you all a question, and it's right in line. It's picking up where you left off, Spencer. If this happened 50, 60, 70 years ago, it'd be on the front page of the newspaper, be circulating around small towns, USA, and it would kind of go in the news and go away. But today, all the things we're talking about, this man is not just able to be celebrated on social media and through the mainstream media, but if you think you might align with that belief, you're able to confirm it immediately and confirm it with thousands of people, meaning you can see immediately the amount of people on X, Instagram, whatever, that are celebrating him too. So it builds this sort of confirmation bias in your mind that like, oh, maybe no, actually not maybe, I'm not crazy. Other people believe what I believe. And what I worry about is because this sounds crazy and dark, and I'm not the crazy dark guy. I'm usually like the bubbly, happy, optimistic guy, glass overflowing. But because it only takes 1, 2, 3, 4 of these guys in the world, in the country to exist, do we worry that we're normalizing this approach to deal with capitalism or business or whatever we don't agree with versus the normal ways we used to deal with those things? I mean, what industry is next? Do we worry that the next industry gets cherry picked as taking advantage of Americans and they recruit one crazy person to go do and act like this?
It's the whole thing is pretend something very ugly. And this brings the following to my mind. It's a bit of a stretch analogy, but it's sort of, I don't think too much of one. So Mitch McConnell today and yesterday was talking about how he's going to be a big check as head of the subcommittee on appropriations for the Defense Department against Trump's isolationism and some of his followers' isolationism. And Mitch said it's looking a lot like pre-World War II, and that's bad. We're confused about who's good and who's bad, and it's going to lead to a bigger conflagration. But assassinating a CEO in the streets and the possible unintended consequences, or just random assassinations in general, brings to my mind World War I and the lead up to World War I. So we should all hope and pray that this kind of private extrajudicial entrepreneurialism doesn't continue to pick up worldwide and set off something bad. I just wanted a quick PSA for our listeners, Spencer, especially our older listeners. You mentioned that your social media feed is awash in thirst posts. Could you define
I'm so
thirst
sorry.
post?
All right. Once again, in these contexts, I always feel I should say this is when I take on my role as the special needs editor of the American Mind. And I do apologize for having to deliver these
As
brain
the youngest member of the podcast, we just sally you with this, even though you're not that young anymore.
It's a real burden that I shoulder willingly for you. I doom scroll so you don't have to. And a thirst post, I'm afraid, is a post when you are thirsty, and that means basically like you have a lust for somebody, or if it's a thirst trap, you are trying to elicit lust from others. And I just, if anybody, it seems unlikely that anybody is listening to this podcast who is also the person dropping this stuff on my feed. But I implore you, I do not wish to see this. Like, there are other attractive people in the world who are not guilty of first-degree homicide or whatever this is. What exactly is the appeal? Anyway, thirsty posts are sort of indecorously.
Send them to Stephen Colbert. He apparently enjoys them.
Yeah, so they're using the occasion of Mangione's ab picture to post their own salacious pictures and express solidarity with him. Yeah, it's pretty sick stuff.
I mean, in any other context, I would be like, yeah, his abs are good. But I don't even want to say that. Like, I don't even want to give that much ground to this guy. Anyway, stop thirst posting about Luigi Mangione.
Yeah. Speaking of thirst posts, we're going to talk about Syria. No.
Wow.
Rough transition.
Hall of Famer right there.
They're a bit oversexed in the Middle East in weird ways. So it's not that big a stretch. So the Assad regime, which was now multi-generational, the better part of half a century, has been toppled by rebel forces led by this group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS as it's known. It was part of al-Nusra, I think, before, but has sort of broken out and rebranded. They were in concert with some Turkish-backed Syrian militias and have taken over Syria and driven Bashar al-Assad to fly to Moscow. It was reported somewhere. I didn't run it down in an ironclad way, but it said Assad will now resume his practice of ophthalmology in Russia, which led one troll to say, "Man, we get your first real doctor from the Syrian refugees, and he doesn't even land in Western or Eastern Europe. He's in Russia." We shouldn't laugh about it. Let's hope. Let's hope that let's hope against hope that this change in Syria doesn't lead to a kind of new footprint for an Al Qaeda or ISIS-like organization, to the detriment, of course, of the Christians and other sort of dissenting, more quietist Islamic groups in Syria. I fear it probably will. The question of what to do about this comes at a terrible time for the United States, because we have a senescent and kind of not really there chief executive, a huge, somewhat rolling constitutional crisis that no one seems to want to talk about. So there's really no one at the helm at the White House. Meanwhile, Trump's basically being treated like the de facto chief executive. Of course, he doesn't wield any actual executive power. So whatever we may decide to do to make this less bad a situation than it is, we're really not equipped to do much about it. And it's just another one of these interesting problems of history where you can't control exogenous shocks outside the United States when you're in a presidential transition. And let's hope that this one stays more quiet than not, and Trump and his team can decide what to do about it, if anything, constructive when they take office here now in about 40 days.
I mean, I am by no means an expert on foreign policy. I don't even know exactly what to think about these guys, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I understand they are projecting a kind of profile that they think Westerners will like, making noises about pluralism and so forth. But as you say, Ryan, they have disreputable connections in their past. Their name also means Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, a thing of which I do not like the sound. That doesn't sound good to me. And so I think, unfortunately, it's just a kind of wait and see thing. I mean, it's a historically significant moment, because I think this is the last of the kind of Soviet cat's paw regimes that was left over after the fall of the USSR in the Middle East. Obviously, a disaster for untold millions of people. As you note, there are Christians in Syria, a significant Christian population who have in particular suffered and may well suffer again. This is not the sort of problem that I hope to be dealing with in the second Trump administration. I would like to be thinking about making the moon and Canada into states, about peacefully conquering England and liberating them from the totalitarian regime they seem to be suffering under. I want the American protectorate to be expanding joyfully into the world and beyond. This kind of stuff, this is bad mojo. And it's the sort of thing that we've said before on this podcast springs up when you have a leadership void. I mean, obviously we've had kind of an empty space in the White House for years, but now we really have a very delicate situation that does not seem to be understood well or managed by really anybody in a position to exert authority. We just do not know who is running the country. I suspect that that's contributing to the boldness of bad actors all over the world. That having been said, Bashar al-Assad, pretty bad actor. So it's always hard to know who to root for in these situations. But I guess at least the possibility that you might get a better regime in there is something to be hopeful about.
I just fear that, I think like Ryan said, that this is just kind of another Libya situation. Okay, Gaddafi's out. Great. What's happened to Libya since then? It's just been an epic disaster. Look at Iraq, same thing. Saddam Hussein, bad guy. Obviously did not want him in power. But then you look at the Christian population, especially there since then. And I just kind of go back to, Trump's Truth Social posts, in light of this, like all caps at the very end, I think of the first one before Assad actually left, the United States should have nothing to do with it, with Syria. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved. And I think, you can call it isolationism, whatever. I mean, the idea that Trump's an isolationist is just the height of absurdity. This is, something John Bolton says. But it's just, I think that really links it back to really more the kind of founders' foreign policy, which is, look, we have to protect our national interests. We have to have, good relations especially with other nations, but there shouldn't be any permanent connections with these nations. And we really don't have the right to go in there and violate their sovereignty. So I think returning to that kind of foreign policy, which it looks like, especially at the State Department with Michael Anton going to the State Department now, some of the other hires, looks like they're kind of going, drifting at least back somewhat to that kind of foreign policy. So I think that would be a great move. And I think just kind of sitting on the sidelines and watching what's going to go on in Syria, I think that's the right move.
Yeah, you keep a lid on it and be in close contact with your allies, especially the one in the region quite close with that is Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And try to prevent it from spilling out in destructive ways. And, the added interesting thing is that, it's Russia really is kicking itself for being overextended in the Ukraine war right now, because they've basically fled their air base and their military installment or naval installment they've been working on in Tartus for a long time, their only warm water port in Syria. So they're in the unenviable position of having to plead, I guess, with Turkey or factions within Turkey and this new group in Syria to try to get back to this strategically important project for them. And the real thing you want to prevent is the spilling out of this into a regional problem that then does start to look like shades of the lead up to World War I. In what ways? I mean, who knows? This is the one thing I'll say, and there are other things to be said for a certain portion of the more responsible neoliberal or neoconservative approach to foreign policy. At their best and at their most honest and non-self-dealing, they worry about the unintended consequences of just doing nothing in this sort of situation. Now, a lot of times their prescriptions are like what I heard on the commentary podcast yesterday, which is, yes, now we can finally bomb the shit out of Iran because they're not going to be able to do anything about it. The time is now. Let's go. Bomb, bomb, bomb. That has its own unforeseen possibilities, as good as it might be to take out Iran's nuclear sites. Use this as an opportunity to. So, it's a mixed bag as always, but let's hope that cooler heads at the Trump NSC and at the Trump State Department, which we should mention, a lot of our listeners know, but our good friend and soon to be former colleague, because he'll take a leave of absence, Mike Anton, will be running the policy planning staff at the State Department. And I'm sure they're already gaming out what the diplomatic and maybe even some hard-edged diplomacy way of proceeding should be on this question of the now more embroiled or recently more embroiled and inflamed Middle East.
How worried are we about, or concerned are we about, the group that took over Syria? Because, everything I've read, I think it's well known that they're sort of what used to be Al Qaeda. Is that right?
I mean,
yep.
And we trust them?
That was.
We're celebrating this?
Sound very good.
A better way to ask. We're celebrating this?
No. We're. So this is what I was saying about their name means the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, which sounds very much to me like some kind of river to the sea nonsense. I mean, we just don't know enough about their actual intentions, I think, with the stipulation that you're always choosing among bad options here, right? Like in these countries, it's very frequently the case that you have to kind of like weigh the murderous dictator against the like aspirationists to the global ummah. And neither of those is particularly appealing, but one of them can have perhaps worse consequences than others at various times. Again, way out of my depth here, but I gather that these guys are actually similar. The relationship between these guys and some of the other Al-Qaeda factions is kind of akin to that between like Trotsky and some of the other Soviet leaders, in that there's a dispute over whether jihad should be local or global. And again, people are really going to have to fact check me on this, but I think that the noises these guys are making are sort of more local. Like they want Islamic rule for Islamic countries rather than like a grand sweep of total devastation across the world, a la, say, ISIL or ISIS. But again, like, does that make me feel good? Do I feel reassured? Do I sleep well at night thinking about that? No, I do not.
And people are talking about how easy it was for them to do this. And it seems like it was. I mean, a 53-year rule fell in a matter of days. I mean, just how powerful was Assad actually? If you sort of go back and look at their civil war, before their civil war, serving in the Syrian army was pretty trivial, relatively trivial, and pretty lucrative. But once they sort of collapsed into this civil war, their economy fell, their standards of living went down, corruption went up, troops were stealing from one another. So many really didn't have a motivation to stay and fight in the army. So they either didn't fight or they left. And this is sort of wrapped into like the greatest lesson in poor foreign policy ever, terrible army. Their allies. I mean, they were so poorly managed. They were nowhere to be found when this happened. Russia was in Ukraine, which prompted Moscow to sort of shift out of Syria. Iran, is tied up with Hamas, and since the October 7th attack on Israel, this is just a poor lesson in strategy. And so I sort of maybe toss it back to Ryan, but one of you all on that's way more educated on the founders than I am, and I learned a lot about John Quincy Adams and his foreign policy and how he was sort of the best and the first to come out with a strong stance there. I mean, what could they have done better? And then, this is hypothetical, but if Trump was in office today, we've talked a little bit about this, but if he had to make a decision today on this, I mean, what should we be doing?
Yeah,
and
John,
let me refer based on sort of the founders' principles.
Yeah, well, this is one of the many times that it comes up almost weekly that we all miss our dearly departed senior fellow Angelo Codavilla, and I'd love to call him up and talk it through with him. But the principles that he expounded in his channeling of John Quincy Adams was the most important thing is to understand the way of life of a place, the regime of a place, and so that we should start there, and that would mean understanding the nature of this group, the strength of their internal command of the Syrian population. I think we want to look after, to the extent that we can, our civilizational cousins in the Syrian Christians, who are going to be, I think, pretty wary of this new arrangement. Less so the Alawites, who are the Islamic sect of Bashar al-Assad, who now I suspect will be unfortunately on the bad end of this arrangement. And doing more. Doing the most good possible and avoiding the most harm, and understanding that I've brought this dictum up before that Angela loved of Teddy Roosevelt's, but the opposite of good conduct in diplomacy is to couple the unbridled tongue with the unready hand. So the worst thing I think we could do would be to make a bunch of noises about how this is bad and this cannot be tolerated, and then really do nothing about it. It's better just to stay quiet if you're going to stay out of it. And I think the primary objective would be, as I expressed, in pretty close consultation with our biggest ally in the region by far, Israel, maybe a little to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia, to figure out what the dangers are of this spilling out of Syria, what the internal dynamics are, and then what we can do about it within reason that falls, I think, much far short of what the American people will have any stomach for, which would be to do anything on the ground in Syria. I think there's not much constituency for that. Now, if you feel that you have to make the case that we absolutely need to do something on the ground in Syria, you'd have to make a reasonable, common sense, and clearly defined case for intervention and for victory. That's something we avoided doing in Iraq and Afghanistan with any real precision, and it led to this kind of sliding morass, which was chewing up American lives and the limbs of American servicemen. Angelo's old line about the great injustice of how we conducted ourselves in Iraq is that we were basically sending our boys across a constantly replenishing minefield, and that's something we should avoid. All right. Well, we've my almost 6-year-old Albert has entered the chat here in the room, and we've run to the end of our time. So, Gates, thanks for stopping by. We're going to have you more often, I think. This is, as you've noticed, a fun hour of some friends just talking about the latest in the news and hopefully imparting some useful facts and maybe even a little wisdom to our listeners. So
I enjoyed it. What I'm most disappointed about is that
yeah,
because this is not video streamed, the audience can't see the 4 just amazing beards represented on the screen right now.
yeah, the beard
You'll have
power
to
is
take our
strong.
word for it.
And then Albert's elf hat. Too.
Yeah.
Yes, I love that.
Putting us all to shame. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening once again to the Roundtable here at the American Mind. If you want to learn more about our work at the American Mind, go to americanmind.org. If you want to see all of our DC happenings, go to dc.claremont.org. And if you want to support our work, go to our main website at www.claremont.org/donate. And I should mention, a new issue of the Claremont Review Books is online. The cover title for a series of essays is called "Make America Great, Again, with J.D. Vance and Trump on the cover. So if you haven't gotten it in your mailbox yet, you're going to shortly. And the
CRB Christmas reading list is coming out on Monday.
Oh, excellent!
Milestone
Yeah,
of every year. Yeah,
Spencer is the good steward of the CRB recommended Christmas list. So check all of that out. Albert, you want to say podcast over?
Podcast over.
We'll talk to you all next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Well done.